Hey there, welcome to episode 11 of the Quaggling Sand audio program. I am your host, Dan Hugo, coming to you today on the 23rd of January, 2024. Today I'm going to tell only some of probably what could be many hours of tales of woe and woe from my time after entering Silicon Valley. So this will be the first wave of my attack on Silicon Valley. I did live there twice, crazy as that may sound. So that'll be a part 2 episode, maybe next week. So it does seem like only yesterday, graduated from Harvey Mudd College, and after looking for a job for a couple of months, I ended up with a referral to go to Silicon Valley. It was always on the list. It was not quite the epicenter that it would become. We were at the tail end of a recession, the Bush 41 recession. The market was weird. Having just graduated, I had a lot of free time to look for jobs. And so when I finally did move up there, it was an interesting time. And that's what we'll be talking about today. First up, the links. Hopefully your podcast audio program platform of choice will display the show notes. I'm really getting to the point where a self-hosted platform is the only way to go. So look for that. I have the links section will be augmented, so I will not say it this time, but I'll update all of the posts on the secondary Spotify for Podcasters portal. So you'll still find all the shows where you find them now, but the content that I publish with the shows, with each episode, is difficult to get to, difficult to find, and so on. My apologies for that. It's not really my fault, but I really should get this project going. I have 4 shows a week, and I would like them to be better available, better presented. There we go. As usual, my shameless self-promotion on buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo. This is not the best place to find all of the details, but it is a good entry point where I link to all of my projects. You do not have to buy me a coffee, but you can if you want to. Monies through this platform, buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo, DanHugo, will literally go to coffee. All of my productions are powered by coffee, if you like. So, but not necessary. Also, my Ko-fi page, ko-fi.com/DanHugo, same thing. I haven't really been using that site. I got to figure out the best way to do it. And I say this all the time. It remains on my to-do list. Maybe I'll do an entire episode on my to-do list. The link to SuperMac technology is an Apple fandom wiki link. SuperMac is long gone, as far as I'm aware. The way it was. I think there's a SuperMac's restaurant or something in Ireland, maybe, but good on them. SuperMac Technology was my first job out of college, my first adventure, the thing that brought me to Silicon Valley. So I'm not linking to every job I had, but I will talk about those. There were a lot. I have created a clip of a calendar, a stylized map calendar that became common. These are common in many cities of industry where there are different big name companies and so on. Kind of gives it a Silicon Valley show feel, I guess. I have linked to the source of that image, the davidrumsey.com website, which has tons of maps. So I grabbed one from the very year in which I moved to Silicon Valley, 1993. Spoiler alert, for the next episode, when I moved back in 2005, I happened to have found a calendar map for that as well. So there you go. A little Easter egg of sorts. Not really. It is obviously not detailed enough, but the density and the changes of some of the placards that are on the map are interesting between 1993 and 2005. And finally, a link to a really interesting book called How the Internet Happened by Brian McCullough. Sorry. It's a link on Goodreads. I know that's an Amazon site, but so be it. You can grab the book in many places. I listened to the audiobook. It was good. It was interesting to hear the stories as it happens, the in this book they cover the iPhone and Palm, which will be in part 2, my re-entry into Silicon Valley. But they do go into some of the early days, including Netscape, which is one of the elements, one of the items on my long list of employers. And it was very interesting to read that take. So if you're interested in learning some, I mean, there's way too much to really cover in one single book, or certainly one single audio program episode. But it was an interesting rundown on some of the highlights of how the internet happened, hence the title. So I was waiting to find a job. I was just graduated. I'll tell you, it was May 1993. Graduated from Harvey Mudd College, my graduating class of, I believe it was 118 people. It was an interesting time of year, interesting time of the decade, I guess, for the economy. A lot of my classmates were going on to graduate school because the job market was tight, or they were pursuing a pure science background, chemistry and physics especially. But for those of us who were trying to be engineers, it was tricky business. I was living in West Dorm. No, I was living in New Dorm. The summer before, the summer housing was in West Dorm, which was convenient because I had lived in West Dorm, so I didn't have to move. Summer housing for that summer, after I graduated, was in Kimberly Dorm at Scripps College. So I did have to move my stuff into a new dorm room. I had almost nothing when life was simple. So I moved into Kimberly Dorm. Matt Masterson, a very fine gentleman, the late Matt Masterson. Now it's unfortunate. The world became a slightly less better place. Matt was always a good guy from Edinburgh, Scotland. Hooked me up with a sweet summer gig. I was copying graduation videos on VHS tapes, believe it or not. And for those of you who are not aware of what a VHS tape is, don't worry about it. So I was copying graduation videos, and he would sign my time card for the recording time. So that helped pay my $50 a week rent and my job search and my general life, renting a movie now and then. I borrowed a VCR. Again, if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. Borrowed a VCR from my roommate Tuck and his TV. And I would walk to Sonamnoan Cafe in Pomona, which was a little dangerous. I somehow managed to get a gym membership for a long time at LA Fitness. So I would walk about 3 miles to the gym, walk to Sonamnoan. I did not have a car. That was fortuitous and prescient, perhaps, that I would be able to get around without one. I did, side note, I sold my car about 7 years ago now. And getting around Vegas, while not ideal without a car, is totally possible. And the car-related crime here makes not having a car... I mean, I can rent a car if I really want one. I have a driver's license, so... But not having to deal with a car, like 95% of the time, amazing, great. Our transit system does suck, but at least we have one. And I walk a lot, so that's good. Anyway, I would walk to these places, and it happens that there was a video rental store. Once again, if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. A video rental store between Sonamnoan and the campus. So on the way back from grabbing some Thai food, I would rent a movie, and then I would head to the gym, which was open 24 hours, I think, or until some very late hour. And then I would get back in the morning and start copying some videotapes again. So it was a weird summer with my shiny new engineering degree and not much to show for it. I did score an interview at General Instrument in San Diego, and had I gotten that job, every single aspect of life would have been drastically different. There's no question about that. So as it turns out, I'm trying to remember his name, Jeremy something, got the job. It was between two of us, and he got the job, so he moved to San Diego, and the rest is history. So I was sitting in my dorm room in Kimberly. Somehow I had access to a phone. This was long before cell phones, so there must have been a phone in the room or something. I ended up speaking on the phone with Bruce at Supermac. It turns out that Supermac, Andrew Eisner, in fact, had been hiring mudders, people from my college, every year for like 5 years, maybe. They had been at Ziff Davis Publishing, Mac Week, especially. So there was at least one Harvey Mudd graduate each year that would refer their friends, and so my referrals, I guess, came from David Stepp, and I think Jason Morse was working there as well. So Jason was living in his mother's home. I can't remember. It was in Livermore. Yeah. So he would drive, and this becomes interesting when we become roommates when I move there. Anyway, so I got flown up to Silicon Valley and was offered the job. It was an interesting interview. One of the people that interviewed me, Mike M., will figure later into my salon, my re-entry into Silicon Valley, salon.com. Mike is a bit of a character, so we'll just leave it at that. But he and Winston, no, not Winston. Winston was one of my coworkers. It was, what was his name? Warren. There you go, Warren, not Winston. Warren and Mike told me after I got the job, moved up there. So I graduated May 15th or something like that, say mid-May 1993. Moved up there and started work on mid-July, July 15th or something. And so I had to go up there, find a place to live. Jason and I became roommates. We found an apartment. If you're familiar with the Sunnyvale area, it was the Oak Point Apartments on Matilda. It was a long walk to work. Supermac Technology, I think singular, was based in a former NSA building, so it had super thick walls that no radio waves could permeate. It was close to the Blue Cube, if you're familiar with that, close to Moffett Field, which you're almost certainly familiar with if you know about the blimp hangars. And we found a place. It was $850 a month for a double master on the third floor, a price of for rent in Silicon Valley that would never be seen again. But we found this place. We moved in. As it happens, we were shown the place during the day. It would only be when we moved in and we discovered that Moffett Field had patrol aircraft coming in from over the Pacific that would land in like 7-minute intervals between midnight and 2 a.m. or something crazy like that. So there was always airplanes flying directly overhead, low altitude on approach. So lesson learned. Do that due diligence when you're moving to a place. But anyway, so I started working at Supermac. I was surrounded by not only David Stepp, who is now a professor at Duke, and I think who else worked there? I think, all the other Mudders were actually at Ziff Davis, because this was the basically the first year that Andrew and Bruce were at Supermac. So they basically had to go hunting with their old Rolodex to find some new people to work at this new venture, Supermac. So Supermac was making video cards, graphics cards really, for Macintosh computers. So they were new bus cards. There were a lot of Macintosh Quadra 900s, I think it was. So a lot of 68040s floating around. My job was to be a benchmark operator, I guess. But before I would move there, let's not forget, I had to get up there. So, fun story, I had to move all of my stuff, which fit into a minivan, everything I owned, with room to spare. A couple of milk crates, a couple of, like an oscillating fan, some clothes, not a lot of stuff. No computers, I did have my, I had a 68030, 2CI. I had a Macintosh 2CI, 68030. So, no, 020, 030, doesn't matter. So I had my Macintosh 2CI and a big, probably 13-inch monitor, CRT. Again, if you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. I had to move up there, didn't have any money, not really. So my buddy Matt, who I mentioned earlier, secured the minivan, the Harvey Mudd minivan, which was supposed to be used by the chemistry department to go pick up some equipment in I can't remember where. It was somewhere near. It was down the street, literally. So they had to go pick up some equipment, but Matt had to have the van. So we got the van, And Matt gave me the keys. He said, all right, good luck. Come back and see us. And my roommate Tuck and I drove the minivan up to Silicon Valley. Tuck helped me move into the third floor apartment. Luckily, there was an elevator. And then he took the van back, and I think he got a speeding ticket. Appropriate sound effect, perhaps. The luck of the draw there. So there we go. Moved into the apartment with Jason, and I was up and running. I would often, if Jason drove to work, great. He had an old Citation, Chevy Citation, classic. But I could also walk to work, which I did often. And that was an interesting time. Because I did not have a car, I would walk to the post office, which was literally down the street, much closer than Supermac. And I, for the first time, got a feel for where I really was, because when I had interviewed, I just went to Supermac, went back to the airport, moved, didn't really see much, right? So I started wandering around. Strangely, I did not experience downtown Sunnyvale for a long time. Later, I would visit. It was called Stoddard's. Now it's the Firehouse or some dumb thing like that. Stoddard's was cool, but anyway, so getting ahead of myself. So I recall the day that I walked to the post office, Sunnyvale Post Office, and there, diagonally across the street, was Sun Microsystems, and I was like, "Wow, infamous Sun!" The dot and the .com, all that. The network is the computer. All their witticisms. There is no privacy. Get over it. Scott McNeely. So I was like, "Wow, that's Sun right there." I guess I am in Silicon Valley, and I would come to see more and more companies I had been reading about and heard about in my travels during my time at Mudd. I had a job in the library at Mudd. I'll talk about this someday, but so I used to sit in the library, either do homework at the desk, right? I was working. So because the traffic was basically, I need the notes, let me check them out, let me go photocopy them, let me return them, right? So it was not a busy thing, but because we were working at the front desk, we had to stay at the front desk. So I had plenty of time to read EE Times and various other periodicals and read any books or whatever. So I read a lot of current news. This was pre-internet. So yeah, suddenly here I am with these various companies I've been hearing about and reading about, and here they are. So that was pretty cool. Started in mid-July, and it was the beginning of the wave, right? 1993 was when the internet started happening, sort of. No, it was arguably the time. I have written 1993 on a graph, on a chart of Silicon Valley growth. You can probably read about venture capital sort of coming onto the scene right around then. So it was a magical time, and I lucked out, got there right in time. I would get laid off on October 1st. A very short stint, to be sure, but seminal. I will say, I will say I have a list of the jobs that would follow. My job was in the crosshairs. Do we really need somebody doing benchmarking? Well, you're a graphic card company selling super high-end, very expensive graphic cards, competing against Radius, doing the same. And the only thing you can compare is performance per dollar. And so, yeah, they cut my job. Andrew and Bruce did, apparently, I'm only going by what they told me, apparently tried to save the role. Lou Doctor would have none of it, and that will come up later. So Lou Doctor, infamous for me pounding the pavement looking for a new gig. It was probably a day or two. Two good connections at Netcom. Netcom was a different story. Two good connections. I did get a job offer for them later, though. Two good connections. Andrew he would call me like a couple days later, probably if my last day was on a Friday, maybe. I didn't even look at the calendar, but it was probably like a Friday. And then probably Tuesday or so, I got a call, Andrew Eisner, hey, you should call these guys over at Storm. So I got a 2-week contract gig. That was the first time I was a temporary employee at Supermac, by the way. I was making $15 an hour. So I took a job at Storm Technologies, a contract for 2 weeks. They were releasing a photo, like a picture editing application to be branded by Apple. Storm itself did some things that were interesting in the image processing world. I think they wrote some stuff for the DSPs, the AT&T DSPs that were on the Thunder 2 card, graphics card that Supermac was selling. So there was a direct connection of sorts. So I got the gig at Storm, worked there for 2 weeks. It was a good experience. It was interesting. It was literally 2 weeks of cash in my pocket. I think it was $20 an hour. So yeah, good enough to bridge that little gap there. One of my colleagues, an employee of the company, his name was Alt, U-L-T, Alt Mundane. That was an interesting tidbit. Very nice people. One of the cultural components that I came away with that I've applied where I could, and people don't often get it, every Friday there, so probably two times that I was there, everyone in the company, and it was a small startup, so probably 20, 25 people, would use the product. They would use the product, in this case, this photograph image editing program. Think of it as like a super duper pared down Photoshop. Like if Photoshop is at one end of a pretty solid spectrum, this application would have been way at the other end, including cost, right, to the user. So everyone in the company would use the product on Friday, and they would report bugs, and there was a bug bounty, so they'd get some sort of prizes and recognition. I thought that was interesting that when you work in a small company, if you have, we'll just fill in some roles. I'm not ranking anybody, but if you have like a person at the reception desk, if you have a person like an office manager, if you have HR, if you have people that are not technical, I'm putting my air quotes up here, at a tech startup, oftentimes there will be a grievous error made that there's an us and them, right? Like, oh, there's the engineers over there at that on that spectrum near Photoshop, and then everyone else is at the other end. And that is never a good idea from a human standpoint. So I really enjoyed the fact that everybody was involved, and I saw that again at UMax. Sometimes you would not see that. You would see that again at Netscape just because they used the browser for everything internally. So everyone was always using the product. But one of the take-homes very early on, for example, when I worked at Supermac, most of us had no access to this hardware. It was too expensive. It was aimed at graphic professionals. They did color matching, pre-press. They did the Proof Positive product, I think it was a dye sublimation printer with a color profiling apparatus to calibrate monitors and color profiles, all that. So not something you would use day to day. However, we probably should have been using these things as intended more often than we were. So we were using the products as testers. I was in QA. That's how I started my career, quality assurance. But we should have been using them as users of the product who were doing QA rather than just running test suites and blindly not understanding things. So a good education for me. So yeah, Storm Technologies, thanks to Andrew. And then when that time was up, got a call from Dave Duran, formerly of Supermac. I think he was still there at the time. He had joined Supermac from Apple Quality. So he sent my resume to Jess Gibson and Linda Adams, Spike, if you're familiar. And so I interviewed with Jess, got a gig, $22 an hour contract through Audia. So I would become an Apple contractor with a green badge, and I would work in Mariani 1. If you are familiar, Mariani 1 was the first Apple building listed as the official Apple Computer Corporation address. So, fun fact. Later, eWorld would take over, and then much later, the Apple iPhone team would be in Mariani 1, but that's in a future that did not include me at Apple. But I got the job at Apple. I started working on the Power Macintosh upgrade card, which was an expansion card that you could plug into your Quadra 900 or Quadra 950 to bring it up to the fabulous PowerPC 601 platform compatibility status. So you could run, you still had your 68040, I think, the 040 was on an expansion card too. So it replaced the 040. Anyway, so you could drop one of these cards in there, suddenly have a Power Mac. Not quite as cool as the Power Macintosh 6000, 7000, 8000, I think they were. And it was during this time, by the way, if you look up the naming controversies, we had Cold Fusion. And by the way, Mike Bell picked these names. Mike Bell would later be the person I reported to through 2 layers of middle management at Intel much later, part 3, while I was here in Vegas. Anyway, so the Power Macintosh upgrade card would make it your recent Macintosh sort of compatible with the PDM, Carl Sagan, and Cold Fusion. So originally the lore was that there were three mythical things: pre-Dennis Man, Carl Sagan, and Cold Fusion. So is Cold Fusion real? Is Carl Sagan real? So it's kind of a joke, I guess. Mike Bell is not known for his human interface to this day. So he got a little bit of trouble from this. And so apparently Carl Sagan, because Mac Week at the time was the official publication of meeting minutes and so on, like the Mac Leak was the euphemism. So Mac Leak clearly had all the code names, and they would talk about them and write about them. And representatives from the Sagan organization contacted Apple Computer and said, we will not tolerate using Carl Sagan as a code name, especially if it's being used in this way. So they renamed it. So then it was PDM, BHA, and Cold Fusion. So BHA was Butthead Astronomer, which was also leaked in Mac Leak. There was no secrets. And so then there was another phone call, and they renamed the project again to Law. And so you would say, you cannot call Carl Sagan BHA, it's the Law. So Project Law. So I was there for that time. Eventually, I would move to the API test group. I would work in that group for $25 an hour, still a contractor. And I applied to be an employee. I was always an Apple fanboy. I had been a fan of Apple since my Apple IIe, since my exposure to the Apple II Plus. The history, I was an Apple user group member in Phoenix, the Arizona Desert Apple Menagerie, later renamed to the Arizona Apple Users Group, I think it was. So always an Apple fan. So once I started interviewing, I would attend launch parties. I would go to VG6, Valley Green 6, where a lot of engineering was. I would attend interviews at Valley Green 6. I had known some of the engineers on the other side of various issue reporting and whatnot. So it was an interesting way to get the foot in the door. However, I also started to see that Apple was not, it's like seeing the kitchen of your favorite restaurant. You start to say, ooh, you missed a spot there. So I cannot say that I was as much an Apple fan after my time working in Apple quality, but it was, you could only work there for 18 months. I think I worked there for 13 months or something, and I kind of got tired of it. So I moved on, and after, I think it was 6 weeks of looking for work, and I don't remember why it was tricky. I think I was more looking for, I don't know what, you know why? Because I was in Apple quality, and I have an engineering degree. Yes, but you're a tester. Yeah, I remember this now. Being branded a tester was something I was not fond of. So I was trying to get away from that suddenly. So I was, oh, no, I'm an engineer. Yeah, but you have only testing experience. Therefore, you are a tester. I found that to be disheartening. But I would eventually get a job at True Vision, which was at the time Raster Ops, but was merging with True Vision, which was a company in Indiana. Raster Ops was sort of a competitor to Radius and Supermac, a lot of monitors and graphic cards, not quite as cool as Supermac and Radius. Radius was always the enemy, but they were fine. So Radius and Supermac were the higher end. Raster Ops was more maybe mid. Raster Ops, famous for having, I believe it was the 2FX, Macintosh 2FX, in a picture next to their graphic card. So they had an Apple secret room, which was a requirement to be a official Apple developer of any hardware. I had been in the Apple secret room at Supermac many times in the lab. So it was an inner locked door. You had to have special access to get into there. So I would go in there sometimes, now and then. The secret room at True Vision, I would see it at Raster Ops, but True Vision was a single locked door off of the main engineering cube area. So not double secure. But at some point before I got there, Raster Ops had invited a Mac World, I think, Mac World magazine. I think, photographer to come and take a photo of one of their graphic cards. And it was in the secret room. So they allowed the photographer in the secret room, and they got a picture with the 2FX kind of in the background. And the 2FX was like super duper secret. So Raster Ops did not have an Apple secret room after that. So they turned it into just a normal engineering workspace. Good times. So we ended up with a QA job, thanks to Terry Berry, who was one of my coworkers at Apple Quality. But turns out I would hit it off immediately with all of the engineers. I was sitting amongst them. So that was good on them to have testers and engineering mixed together. Got to know Marshall Johnson, Ray Picard, especially, very, very smart guy. I was able to, we were doing an MPEG graphic card, Motion JPEG. It was before MPEG caught on, before it was feasible at a reasonable price. And in fact, I remember they were very excited about Motion JPEG being superseded by the more capable MPEG with iframes, keyframes, all that. So Motion JPEG was single field only compression. So you could get certain levels of compression. It was a lot of data. Back then, you would have to use RAID 0, striped RAID, across 6 SCSI 3 drives as fast as you could get them to capture without dropping frames. Nowadays, you can capture 8K video on a flash disk, right? So crazy. So I remember having a discussion with Ray, and he said, we're trying to adjust the quality control algorithm so that the quality of each field doesn't go nuts when they start dropping frames. Normally they would say, oh, we dropped a frame, slam the quality. So the quality factor would determine how much compression is applied to a field. There's 2 fields per frame. So when you say 30 frames per second, it's 60 fields per second. There you go. So each field could have a separate Q factor, quality, and that would determine how blocky the JPEG image looked, how pixelated. So the adjustment was very hard. Like it would drop the quality immensely. So I said, hey, why aren't you using a feedback control loop to measure the fullness of the buffer, which is an indication of the data throughput to the disk? And as it gets closer and closer to full, you start adjusting the Q factor slowly so that you're not overflowing the buffer as fast. So you're adjusting the quality factor in direct relation to how full you'd want the buffer to be, which would be, the set point. And of course, we learned about feedback control systems in experimental engineering and systems engineering at Harvey Mudd. So Ray, being a computer architect, software architect, was like, oh, I never thought about that. So that was my foray into applying my engineering background. I also sat with Marshall in the lab trying to figure out why our video capture card, the Targa, if you're familiar, Targa 2000. And by the way, if you're a True Vision video editor, I believe it was Avid that bought True Vision, and then Pinnacle bought Avid. So the exciting world of video editing and production. Prosumer. So I sat with Marshall. Then they eventually offered me a job in the engineering department. So that involved changing my title and pay, but not much else. But the really interesting thing was they sent me to Japan. So they got me business cards. They paid for my passport expedited delivery. And I flew to Japan to meet with Sony on a DV Pro project. So my first foray into the exciting world of global travel, I traveled with Ron Wood, who was the Senior VP of Asian Pacific Sales. Super guy, good time, very educational, spending time in Japan with Mr. Wood, Udo-san, and good times. And so I engaged with the Sony engineers. We actually got a demo working, speaking no common language other than C. We both happened to have started with the same QuickTime video sample code, so we could integrate their front end with the codecs and whatnot that I got working on ours to do. I believe we were doing video splitting, and you could display one field per frame from each camera source. So it was a little bit hacky, but it was making the most of the available hardware bandwidth and whatnot. So that was great. Everything came together. It was a good time in Japan. My first week, a full week in Japan. It was right after the OM I think it's Ohm, sarin gas bombing at the Shinjuku subway station. We were staying at the Shinjuku Hyatt, which meant we would go through that train station every day, multiple times per day. And it was an interesting view to see, another country, another culture, and then everybody's wearing masks. That would be telling and prescient again. There were no garbage cans. It was just a very different experience, and not like that in other subway stations. So that subway station in particular was on high alert. Eventually, I would be tired of True Vision, so I would go on a little job hunt. I eventually got referred by Linda Spike Adams, from the Apple Quality days to work in the Newton group at Apple. I also interviewed at Netcom, I think. But the Newton group seemed interesting. I was particularly interested in the way the Newton was looking. I had a MessagePad 100 when I was working at SuperMac, and now they had progressed to the MessagePad 120 and what I would be working on. Once again, the quality group, but I was in the API test group for the C++ SDK for the Newton, which meant I got to learn a lot more about how the Newton really worked and how to code on it and whatnot. Learned some Newton script, met Walter Smith, met, what was his name? Sandy something. He became the president or CEO of the Newton.com attempt at a spin-out or spin-off, which stopped when Jobs went back to Apple and did the day of reckoning for all the different groups. And as it happens, later I would be working at UMac, so I'll wait for that part. But yeah, so I met all these famous people in the nerd world while working in the Newton group. It was really educational. I think I worked there for 6 months on a contract doing some test code development for this SDK, software developer kit. Learned a lot about the ARM processor. They were using strong ARM in the project that was going to come out, which was the MessagePad 1000 maybe. It was the dual PCMCIA landscape and portrait, but it was meant to be sort of rotatable. The Newton software was really interesting, except really slow. But the strong ARM was a new thing. It was the digital equipment people who did the alpha decided to do what they did on the ARM. And so they made a really fast ARM, which Intel would buy and during the Compaq debacle. And so Compaq ended up with some of the technologies. Intel ended up with some of the others. When Digital Equipment Corporation got split up, strong ARM became X-Scale, and I would later work on pre-silicon validation for the X-Scale. So yeah, everything feeds back on itself. So the Newton group was fun. I did learn Newton script, which would become an interesting reference soon. Then I worked at SCM Microsystems for Bruce from SuperMac. I was a marketing technologist. I would go to France and learn all about smart cards. ISO 7816 for the win. So SCM was really in the PCMCIA interface world, but their acquisition of a former Gemplus employee, Schlumberger or one of those. I cannot remember his name, but he spun out. SCM acquired him. SCM was a company started in Erfurt, East Germany, in a house with several German engineers, super good guys, all. They stayed with this company through the acquisition by a company, a buyer in Munich. So there was Munich and Erfurt joined across some border for a while. The Erfurt guys were intensely nerdy, but also all friends and whatnot, so they all were very supportive of each other. I remember one of my colleagues there, Detlef Jeanette, was heard to say when visiting the U.S., when we took him on a little tour, he said, we work 24 hours in the day and then we work at night, to give you some sense of their work ethic. We bought Detlef some, now of course horrible, but at the time the Bible of Silicon Valley, some Dilbert books, all of the comics of Dilbert, Scott Adams, and my other favorite Detlef witticism. We were driving in a rented minivan through the city of San Francisco. I think we had walked across the Golden Gate or something. So he's sitting in the van, laughing out loud. And he holds up the book at some point and says, "It is funny because it is true." So good times. Good times that left. And Siggy and I used to like to go hang out at Stadod's, have a pint now and then. So good people, good times. The Munich people were more stiff and rigid and German, I guess. So they were not as fun. I have some more SEM stories. My time in France was very educational. The French are completely different yet again. I stayed at the Hotel King, which was on the Mediterranean, on the Côte d'Azur. My window, my sliding glass, what is it, the patio sliding glass door, looked out onto the water. It was a room that probably could have cost thousands of dollars, but for the fact that we were there before Easter that year, and because La Ciotat, the city in which I found myself, was a tourism spot for typical European, April vacations. Everybody in Europe goes on vacation, which is good. Good for them. We should have that. We were there right before that, so the town was empty. Andreas Wolf from Erfurt and I from the Los Gatos office met up there, and we were the only two staying in this hotel, so we would go have dinner in their restaurant sometimes through the week, or a meal, and it was just the two of us. And the person that had the hotel, it was the Hotel King, named after Elvis Presley, so there was a black velvet Elvis Presley painting at the entrance. We would walk through the city. I met some people. Of course, you would think as an American, you're like, oh, the French are French. But it turns out the Parisians are the people everybody thinks about. And other people in France also talk about the Parisians as being very Parisian. So the people of La Ciotat, super friendly, really cool, fascinated by the Dallas Cowboys, which I'm not a fan either way of, but very excited at the visitors from America and from Germany. But, the people in France they know about Germany. So visitor from America in a town that was otherwise empty. So geared totally towards tourism, people visiting the coast, really. But we had some good food, good times. At one point, I went out to lunch with one of my colleagues, Philippe. Sounded like he was always doing an impression of Monty Python, the guards that at the top of the wall that are they catapult a cow at the Monty Python gang at some point. So he's got his outrageous French accent like that, which would come into play when I was in Toulouse at Intel. That comes later, part 3, when I'm here in Vegas. So Philippe suggests that we go to lunch and we will have some great French food. I'm like, okay. So we pile into 2 different cars, 2 little tiny cars, and we're going down these streets, like driving up on the sidewalk to get past another car. They're super narrow, very pedestrian. We come to a spot also on the coast, so there's the water out there. We see people playing bocce ball. If you know what bocce ball it is, it's Italian lawn bowling. And Philippe says, "Do you like the French bowling?" And I said, "Oh, I thought that was something." Okay, yeah, cool. And then we went into this French restaurant, which was serving Italian food. It was lasagnas and other traditional, we call it peasant food, I think, the pastas and red sauces and so on. So it was a nice time, an introduction to the French version of Italian food, I guess. There were animals running around in the restaurant, pets, I think, probably dogs and stuff. So it was fun. It was there. I'm not complaining about any of this. It was an interesting time, but it was yet more introduction to other cultures, which I think is a pretty core part of my education, which we'll get to. I would leave SCM because they really had no use for engineering anything in their Los Gatos office, which was 100% sales. It's the only reason they were there. I did meet the founders of Rocketbook, who would later Rocket something. It was the precursors to e-ink book readers, e-books, I guess, e-readers. So they had these super high resolution, quote unquote, super high resolution, very white, very high contrast, so black text, white background, LCDs. So they were showing off the display technologies to Philips, we were in the flat display systems group. So very interested. So I went to the Philips Semiconductor facility in Palo Alto with my colleagues, Brad, and this is later. But I would meet the people who would later go on to found Tesla before Elon Musk came along. But anyway, I was tired of SEM Microsystems, so my friend David Carlton from Harvey Mudd slid my resume over to Jeff Winter in the Core Technologies group, because David was going to go and work in the Java group, Java Foundation classes, which would later become Swing. Swing? I think it's Swing. Spring? Swing. One of those. So David gave my resume to Jeff Winter, and oh, look at that. Dan is working on smart cards. We are going to do work with smart cards as part of our secure computing stuff. The Core Technology Group was responsible for NSPR, the Netscape Portable Runtime, and SSL, libsec. All the security bugs you've ever encountered came from our group way back when. 96, I think it was, 97, 96, somewhere in there. So David gives my resume to Jeff. I show up in the Mountain View office when Netscape had like 2 buildings. So I show up, I meet with the recruiter, whose name was, I want to say Victoria, but it may have been something else. Started with a V. A pleasant older woman, very nice, very helpful. Brought me into the meeting room. I had an interview with probably 6 people. They asked me several questions about smart cards. I was able to answer all of them. For as little engineering that I did at SEM, I learned quite a bit, especially during my trip to France to meet the smart card team. So that was convenient. Got the job, nice pay. I want to say I was now making like 50, 60,000 a year. I know, big dollars, right? So I started working as a real engineer, actual software developer at Netscape in the Core Technologies group, which we would later call the Hardcore Technologies group because we were doing all this low-level stuff. I would work on several projects, including the interface for secure email, SMIME. I worked with Jamie Zwinski and Lisa Repka on the SMIME part of the mail and news, as we call it. I worked on a ACE server component for Basic Auth. If you are familiar with Secure ID, you may not be, except that today you call it like Google Authenticator, etc. So at the time, it's TOTP, a time-based one-time password. You'd have it looked like a credit card with a little display on it, or like a pocket calculator that would fit in your wallet. Remember those? So it had there were some that had numbers on them, so you could type in a PIN. But generally speaking, these had a number, 6 digits probably, that would change every 30 seconds, whatever. So I coded up this component to do Basic Auth. Nobody knows what that is anymore. It would do Basic Auth with your one-time password that was time-based, so that you could log into secure systems with this token. So it was something that would be a part of what the smart cards were going to do, so that general area. What else did I work on? I worked on a couple things. So it was an interesting time. I met Brendan Ike, met Jamie Zwinski, of course, met my friend's father, David's father. Phil, thank you. Jeez, I was like, it wasn't Carl. No, it was Philip Carlton. Went to David's house, met his parents. I had never met them before. So I met them. I didn't meet them when we graduated, for example. David and I graduated together from Harvey Mudd College. I had known him the entire time. That's an entire story on itself. The collaboration between David Carlton and Dan Hugo on dorm living in West Dorm, but that's another story. So I met Phil and his wife, and I do not remember her name. Later, unfortunately, Philip and his wife would be killed in a car accident in Italy on my birthday. So June of that year. Very sad. David Carlton was an only child. So if you are at all familiar with famous computer science quotes, you will have heard Philip Carlton's name because he will tell you there are 2 problems in computer science. Cache line invalidation and naming things. And later it would be augmented to add one off by 1 error. So the joke being 2 problems and 3 items. So that was Phil Carlton, David Carlton. I have David to thank for my that step of my career where I actually became an engineer for real. So that was an interesting time. Netscape was certainly an interesting company to work for. If you check out the How the Internet Happened book I mentioned earlier, you will hear about Netscape. Mark Andreessen, the Eric Bina. Eric Bina was technically in our group, I think, although I never met him. He was still at NCSA in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. But interesting time, definitely educational. But I would leave eventually. I was at an offsite meeting at Jeff Winter's house, his new home in Los Gatos, and I announced to our entire group at the same time, which was probably bad form, but there were layoffs coming, so eventually there was no harm really. But I should have this is a learning experience. I should have told Jeff Winter ahead of time, the manager of the group. Jeff Winter, by the way, excellent manager, probably the best manager I've had of any technical organization, but maybe even any. Completely competent and knew exactly how to protect his employees while supporting them and communicating and all kinds of good things. So yeah, an excellent character in this story. So Jeff Winter set the bar. But I would depart to join UMax Computer Corporation. This was Bruce again. They were looking for someone. Now I was working at Netscape, which was famously running on all of the platforms. The browser would run on just about any computer you could find. And in fact, if you want to hear about some of that, the Tinderbox and all that was around that, I did a fabulous episode of Let's Innovate for Vegas with Tara Hernandez, who was running the build group. And so we talked about how there was support for like a dozen Unix platforms and Mac on 68K, Mac on PowerPC, Windows 3.1, no, not, was it Windows 3.1 maybe, but definitely Windows 95, 98, Windows NT 3.5.1, BOS, the list went on. So there were plenty of, and of course the server ran on various Unix machines, plenty of computers all around me all the time. My first foray into Linux, I installed Linux on my Compact Desk Pro, whatever it was. I had to use the PCI hack to change the entry points to boot. So I had to use Loadlin and whatever. Good times. So I built my first Power Pentium Pro machine. I could go into at length how I would download Debian packages because I was using Debian on my machine at work. I would download Debian packages, bring them home to update my home-built machine because my US Robotics 33.6 modem was not quite up to snuff for big giant downloads, but we'll get to that later. So joined UMax Computer Corp. My original role was back in the days when there was going to be PowerPC platform. Initially it was Common Hardware Reference Platform, or CHIRP. Then it was PowerPC Reference Platform, PREP. Then it was PowerPC Platform, so PPCP. And it was going to be a PowerPC. So remember Apple had launched the Power Macs with the 601. The PowerPC was actually a collaboration between Apple, Motorola, and IBM. Motorola contributed the 88,000 hardware interface. IBM contributed the Power instruction set, ISA, instruction set architecture. And Apple, of course, put all this together and had an operating system running on top of it. Taligent, or Pink, was right next door to Mariani 1 for a while. And it was the operating system of the future and still is. So the fact that UMax was building PowerPC platform meant they were interested in a computer that could run Mac OS, Windows, and at the time Sun OS was going to be the first one, but Unix flavors for PowerPC. I just told you I had been touching all these computers from all these different operating systems and platforms and so on. So they were like, oh, you can be in charge of all that. I was like, okay. And then PowerPC platform sort of became less interesting to everyone. But here's the deal. Here's the power pivot for your career. I had a machine on my desk, a S900, which was the UMax equivalent of the Power Mac, whatever, PowerPC running thing. And I had put Linux PPC on it so that I could run Linux for PowerPC. And it was good enough. It was still a work in progress, but I could run Linux code on there. I could, bash shell, all that. So my manager, it wasn't my manager at the time. It was the manager of the firmware group, James Benninghouse, came up to me, or I ran into them or something. And they're like, oh, we have the firmware drop, but it's built on the RS6000s at Apple. So you basically got this whole GNU compiler chain thing. And they had an MPW, Macintosh Programmers Workshop, sort of cross-compilation toolchain environment that they could sometimes build in, but it was not reliable. So I saw it, and again, we were building for all the Unix platforms and all that. So I said, oh, I have all these tools on my machine over here. So I took the sources, got them on my Linux PPC S900, built the firmware, lickety split. And James said, do you want to be in the firmware group? So suddenly I was writing PowerPC assembly in the RTAS layer, the runtime abstraction services. So I would do postcode, then RTAS, which was also fourth. So the open firmware stuff. So I was writing postcode at PowerPC assembly and then into the RTAS, which was C compiled, but you gotta look at the assembly. And then our open firmware. So I was learning fourth for PowerPC. As it turns out, Dr. Hansen Ting, C.H. Ting, Chang Hansen Ting, I think it was. Dr. Ting, like world renowned in the fourth community, working in our group. There he is, the guy. And so he was writing like a custom fourth environment for our open firmware. And I got to write some fourth words, do a hack to get our Arthur processors with backend caches working. So I was totally sleeves rolled up, hands-on with every aspect of our system bring up. So I had, we would hover over our Basecamp boards. There were only 10 of them. Each one was different, so you had to account for hardware changes. There's an airplane flying, if you can hear that. Not very near, but the Air Force Base, Nellis, not far from here. So it was a tremendous learning experience. And then eventually Apple would pull back the licensing reins, bring it all back home. So we would switch to Intel. At the time, Intel and not Silicon Graphics. It was Intergraph. Their offices were very near Silicon Graphics. And I think, in fact, they had some SGI engineers that had developed some crossbar, like high performance data transfer technologies working at their company. And Intergraph was like the boutique small system integrator that Intel would showcase their new parts with. So somehow there was a lawsuit, and the founder and the main guy, Andy Chang, I think it is, from UMax Data Systems in Taiwan was sitting next to Andy Grove. And he said, hey, we can become your new boutique company. And while Intergraph was in Mountain View, we were located directly down the street from the R&B building in our offices across the street from Great America. So, and as you may have heard, I worked at Intel later. So we had first dibs on the first Pentium 2 parts that would come to us with the yellow books. If you know what yellow books are, and trays of parts. We had our FAE, Eric Sindelar, who I think is still working at Super Micro today. We had marketing money. We had a need for a motherboard designer because the big giant layoffs took everybody out when we stopped doing Mac clones, and PowerPC platform, of course, was out. So my roommate from college, Kevin, decided he wanted to stop being a sales engineer for the gas company and start doing what we were doing. So he came up, and his first out the gate motherboard, he was working at Philips actually, later when he would do more of this. But his first, so I got ahead of myself there. He would later take these skills and run with them. He had never designed a motherboard before, designed two of them, single and dual Pentium 2 parts. We started with a reference design, so, I'm not diminishing his results, but he didn't have to start with a blank canvas. So that was good for him, good for us. Everything worked. Yeah, the Intel people approved it. And I was doing BIOS development, so I was getting down and dirty with the 68K and the postcard, and the we had the BX chipset that you could actually run AGP, the advanced graphics port, at full bus speed, 100 megahertz back then. All kinds of super nerdy hackery, very educational. And then UMax eventually would reach its end of life. So once again, Bruce to the rescue would bring a bunch of us to Philips. Bruce and Brad Fuller. Brad Fuller I had met at Supermac Technology back in the day. He was doing quick draw acceleration. So he was really hands-on with video, image display, graphics, I should say, not really. Well, yeah, video, quick draw, QuickTime. So we started working at Philips. The first day of our new software and electronics business unit in the flat display systems group in Philips Components, which was one of 7 global business units, I guess, however they demarcated that. Brad, Bruce, and myself flew to Eindhoven, met the people working at the NAT Lab on some scalar technologies and displays. Philips was making all of the displays for Nokia cell phones and desktop Nokia displays at the time. They were moving to LCD displays. So an interesting time. Philips was an interesting company. It was the first time I had worked at a company globally dispersed, that many people, 160,000 at the time. All of the politics, all of the silliness, all of the drama. So not a great time. They did not do incentive stock options. I remember at some point calculating that I missed out on $60,000 had they given me a 1 basic grant for my first year that would have vested. I would go to Thailand for the Y2K switch, and on my return, I would depart Philips to work for Motive Power, which was a 4-person startup. Dennis Teoman, who I had met at UMax, who presently I think still works at Apple, he wanted to do an accelerator card that would use dynamic RAM, EDD at the time. I think it was EDD. So DIMMs of your old RAM you could put on a PCI card, battery backed, and use it as a disk cache, so RAM-based disk cache, that would be battery backed and would have its own caching algorithms that we were then tuning. So Kevin, I mentioned earlier, he left Philips. So Kevin and I worked next to each other at Philips and designed things that worked the first time and all. It was pretty cool to work that tightly, kind of in lockstep with a colleague with whom I had so much background. This is why people like to hire their friends, because you know them and you know how they work and so on. So also educational. So Motive Power, we built this stuff, Linux and Windows caching. Eventually the seed funders, who were all UMax people, would kind of throw their hands up. I will say there was an attempt to partner with Adaptec. And I said, so the idea was, and the demo, in fact, was, look, you don't even have to use the disk anymore with the Motive Power cache. And I said, you're going to go to a company that sells SCSI 3 controllers down on the motherboard or SCSI cards. Their whole thing is about you need more disk, more performance, more disk, more disk, more disk. And you're going to tell them, now you don't need disk. I said, they're if they do partner, they're going to buy and shut. So we came up with a way we called it proactive caching. So try to keep things in the cache from these fast disks proactively. So it would be there before you needed it. So we started doing like statistical analysis on file system usage, which things were happening, which times of day or with other things and all that. It was interesting. Ultimately, a reorg at Adaptec put all that to rest. And I would depart Motive Power, no harm, no foul, had money in the bank, to work at Leapfrog. This was the first time in my entire Silicon Valley career that I had gotten a role at a company not knowing anyone. They wanted someone who could work with an 8051 that they used in their custom toy chips. Leapfrog was an educational toy company. They have since been acquired by VTech. Guess what Philips was, and might still be, I don't think they are anymore actually, but Philips was like the number one supplier of 8051 variants, and all the products that I was working on while I was with Philips were 8051 based. If you don't know what the 8051 microcontroller is, you have missed out. So I was totally familiar with a bunch of variants and assembly, the Keel compiler, which was like the de facto, everyone used the Keel C compiler for 8051. So they're like, oh, do you want to work on toys, educational toys? And I was like, yeah, sure. So met a bunch of cool people, very motivated, true believers in the Los Gatos engineering office. Once again, in Los Gatos, just like SCM Microsystems, literally down the street from SCM. I would drive by this random company called Netflix on my way to Leapfrog. What are they up to? Netflix? Oh, red envelopes with DVDs in them? Interesting. So Motive Power on to Leapfrog. Leapfrog would be the end of my time in Silicon Valley. I was not a fan. I was not enjoying my time. It was time to leave. Even the guy I was working for, the VP of engineering, was like, yeah, I would probably leave too. And he was one of the co-founders of the company. So I bid farewell. I moved to Phoenix. By the time I finished moving, it was the end of August of 2001. Luckily, nothing major happened on the 11th of September in 2001, so everything was fine. We're almost done. We're about halfway. Probably the longest episode of Quaggling Sand ever. So I'll just run through. I made a couple of notes. That was working in Silicon Valley, my first time, my first window of opportunity in the valley, Silly Valley, as I call it. Living in Silicon Valley was interesting. In the beginning, it was not expensive to live there. It was just a normal city. There were people there they had bought their homes, in the 70s or 80s, and this was 93 to 96. 93 was fine. 96, things went nuts. Always going nuts through that time. So when I got there, our rent was $850 for a double master, and I lived with Jason. I would walk to work at Supermac. Everything was fine. When I would leave, when I was working at Leapfrog for $100 an hour, woohoo, big dollars. We were spending $2,000. I was living with Kevin in a house. We moved in for $1,850 a month, and they raised the rent to $2,500 a month merely because they could. Market rate, so $2,500 a month. That was too rich for our blood. So I would move to Phoenix eventually. The expectations were low and always met from a personal standpoint. People were interested. I mean, not that they were low in a bad way, but like, we're all doing our thing. There's lots of opportunity here. A lot of very smart people that were interesting, doing cool stuff, always running into people. A lot of meetups and gatherings where you'd, hey, this is my friend from this other company I used to work at, and my friend from college, and so on. And so you'd meet people all the time. And there was no LinkedIn. There was no real internet yet. There were no cell phones, really, not for mere mortals. So the rich kids would have them, but mostly no. So yeah, you would just meet people. It was great. And then the rents, though, started ramping up, and they would continue to do so, I think today even still. Silicon Valley is in a great part of the country as far as weather. Occasionally there will be some drama with extreme temperatures and some fog, but where I lived in Sunnyvale, California, it was always lovely. Academia, extremely strong, with Stanford probably the most famous or infamous even. They often say now that Stanford is a venture capital company with a university attached to it. So we were there for the early days, but really Silicon Valley started with Stanford in about 47. So that's an entire cultural evolution that really started at Stanford. And then it wasn't that, though. It is part of the history, but it was not like, oh, Stanford is why all this happened. That wasn't really recognized when you were there, but it was Stanford. It was Stanford University. Is it university? Stanford was just the epicenter of a lot of things. So was Berkeley. So was Santa Clara University. So was San Jose State. And Santa Cruz. So a lot of academia, but a lot of people coming from other countries, other places around the country, this country, but other countries as well. So my Netscape coworkers were from a variety of places. My Philips coworkers were from a variety of places, et cetera, et cetera. So the one thing that I miss in this part of my presentation here was that people were very eager to do referrals and pass resumes directly. You'd say, hey, can I give you my resume? Yes, I will give it to my hiring manager. And that's what would happen. That's how Dave Carlton got me a job at Netscape. When we were working at Philips, Mike M., who would figure in later at Salon and figured in initially at Supermac, I gave his resume directly to the hiring recruiter, whatever, HR recruiter guy at Philips. About a week later, went to him and said, hey, have you contacted Mike? And he said, oh, no, it didn't seem like a match. So I tossed it. And we were like, no, that's not how that works. And so proactively engaged in the hiring process as a referrer. When I worked at Netscape, there was a referral bonus of $1,500. I referred 7 people who got job offers, and none of them accepted. So that was painful. But it was an interesting time because people were interested in having their friends or former colleagues or people they trusted or people they knew at least work with them or near them, take part in success and whatnot. There was a general understanding that if you were part of hiring good people, then you would benefit by having a better company, better workplace. So that was an interesting component. And then as well, you could talk about startups. You would very often be sitting at lunch with someone and say, I have this idea. And they're like, oh, that sounds cool. You want to work on it. So very fertile ground for innovation and innovation culture that has been reproduced around different parts of the world before and after, but certainly a lot of things came together. And I happened to have lucked out and gotten there. I didn't really capitalize. I'm not in the Mark Andreessen class. I didn't launch Moxie. No Reardon Steel for me, but there was an interesting. It was an interesting time, to be sure. So don't worry, we're coming to the end. I noted a few things that I learned or encountered or changed during my 7 years, 1993 to 2001. So it was mid 1993 to mid 2001. So first, I learned about workplace dynamics and job hunt networking. You really got to stay in touch with people. Because I was laid off in October of the same, July to October, not even, it was mid-July to October, at Supermac. So I came away with my glib summary. You start looking for your new job. No, you start looking for your next job the first day starting at your new job. So you should always be looking for the next thing. This is true probably in most cases, unfortunately. That is very glib. I got my first cell phone when I was working at Netscape, got the employee discount on the Nokia 2160. It was a beast of a phone. CDMA, I think, on the Singular network. And I left town with my Nokia 6190 when I was working at Philips. Philips was making the displays for the 6190, which was arguably one of the most amazing feature or candy bar phones that Nokia made. Like a rock solid. And it was GSM 900. No, I'm sorry, 1900. GSM 1900 on the Singular network at the time. And then when I moved to Phoenix, it would be on the VoiceStream network, which would then change its name to T-Mobile when texting was called Ping Pong. I went from using my US Robotics 33.6 kilobit per second dial-up modem to being one of the first 50 DSL subscribers in Sunnyvale at that house it was on Ponderosa in Sunnyvale, across the street from a school, very near the Fry's Electronics on Wolf, near the Plug and Play in Sunnyvale. Those will figure into the modern day more than they should. So being one of the first 50, we had like super fast, we might have had symmetric, like 384 both ways, 384 kilobits or something. So it was super fast by those standards. There was a deal where we were getting our modem dropping connections all the time. I wrote a cron job, captured a bunch of data. Long story short, got our Alcatel modem firmware fixed when they were arguing with me, so I had to do some data capture. It was in this house. So we were working, Kevin and I lived together. We were working for Philips this was post UMAC. So Philips and Motive Power, and my final days at Leapfrog before I would hit the road. I worked in many areas. I made maximal use of my Harvey Mudd education. I told you the story about Ray and the feedback control system for quality factor adjustments in video capture and caching. So I made maximal use of Harvey Mudd education, and that whole notion of just because you don't know it doesn't mean you can't do it. And I added more to that education over my tenure. And I learned that I prefer doing things that I've never done before. I don't want to do the same thing for 20 years. And I haven't. I started with a Jetta 3. That was my first car that I leased when I got some money together after Storm Technologies. I actually had to get to Apple to get the interview. I had to take a bus. And the bus was late or something. There was something interesting about the bus, but the bus luckily stopped right in front of Mariani 1, so that part was okay. But I didn't have a car. I didn't have a car until shortly after I got the job at Apple. Leased a Jetta 3. Later, when I moved away from Silicon Valley, I would have a GTI VR6, which was a blast to drive, a 6-cylinder Golf, essentially. Total fun driving around. I would hit the end of the lease. I was into leasing cars because I could write it off. I was just contracting, and I always had my own business of some sort on the side. I would eventually, just before I moved, get a Jetta. What did I get? Just a normal Jetta, but it was black. It was a little more stylish. Very nice. I think it was also a 6-cylinder vehicle. That would change when I was in Phoenix when I got into a car accident. Hit and run from anyway, not my fault. But we'll talk about that another time. I was more social in college, so during my time I became much more focused on work instead of sort of day to day. So I didn't know any of my neighbors. This was a complete change from my time in college when I knew everybody, right? To this day, I don't know who lives around me. Probably bad. While I did always remain loyal to the hiring companies, that is, I didn't engage in any skullduggery, I was much more focused on self-preservation. So like I said, I always had to look for the next job on starting a new job. I was always concerned about layoffs and whatnot. So that's not great. I mean, self-preservation is a good thing, but it became the dominant thing. I was also chasing stock options, and so that ends up being kind of a bummer. So I came to realize that you should start your own company. If you are benefiting from the efforts of founders, if that's your goal, well, you'll get what you get. So self-determinism and self-preservation, two great tastes. The old ways of workplace faded away during my time there. That is, I was given helpful advice like, oh, make sure you get to work early, stay late, always wear a tie, stay there for 40 years, retire, etc., pension. So all those things became very apparently anachronisms, and you kind of had to adapt to, oh, I guess I will be working here for 6 weeks or 10 months, and that's it. There was so much chaos with companies coming and going, layoffs and funding and not. Luckily, chaos is opportunity. There is some baseline being played right now, which I will endeavor to filter out a little bit. But for the most part, if you hear a little boom, that's my life. My salary grew at Silicon Valley rates on internet time. So when I moved to Phoenix 7 years after I got to Silicon Valley, one time somebody actually laughed at how much I was making because they were, oh, you'll never make that here. I said, yeah, you asked my salary history, not my adjusted, whatever. But expectations were set and so on. So that made it actually tricky to get jobs. You had to always preface by saying, well, this was in Silicon Valley, and a lot of people didn't understand that, etc. So I developed a pretty solid network of contacts. Again, work contacts. With all the job changing and social engagements in general, those would kind of fade away when I moved, unfortunately. I did move, and then 9/11 happened. So Silicon Valley became a weird place. Remote work became problematic. Traveling to places, all that stuff. So I'm not going to say it was 100% because I moved, but by not being in my environment that I had spent 7 years sort of developing for myself, I probably missed out on some things. So lesson learned, life lesson learned. I did build several computers during my time there, which I would never have thought to do, really. I built my dual Pentium Pro machine, became a big AMD fan. We almost worked with AMD until the Intel deal was signed. Then AMD became our worst enemy at UMax, but I still like AMD better, even though I worked for Intel later. Home building a computer was something I probably would not have thought to do if I had taken the job at General Instruments. In General Instrument, they were making cable boxes, by the way. General Instrument down in San Diego would have been a totally different world. And as I mentioned, professional relationships are fleeting. Once the dot bomb era hit, like everybody scattered. Coming to a close, I'm going to say a couple things about the HBO series. Sometimes, especially when I first moved to Vegas, I was asked if it was like that. And, some people refer to the Silicon Valley series as an actual historical document, a timeline to follow, a place for ideas for how to conduct business and so on. Don't do that. No one company that I ever encountered, heard of, or heard legends of experience all of the things that Pied Piper went through. certain aspects of what they went through were experienced by different people, different companies. So obviously for the sake of the show, they put everything on this one company. So that so far from reality, it's ridiculous. And of course, everything was exaggerated. So some of the scenarios did play out here and there during my time in Silicon Valley, but not, I mean, definitely dramatically enhanced with a healthy helping, if is that a word, of comedy, stirred in, not sprinkled on top, but stirred throughout. I will say, though, I would give just about anything to have a team like Pied Piper ended up with. Guilfoyle and Dinesh and Jared, whatever his name is, and the CEO, who later the actor turned out to be kind of weirdo, so I can't remember his name. But yeah, Dinesh and Guilfoyle especially, even though Jared was a core member of the team, I'm not diminishing that, but Dinesh and Guilfoyle, they were making stuff happen day to day, and they stuck with it. The whole team stuck together through all this ridiculous, exaggerated drama. So I would totally, especially during my time re-entering Silicon Valley, I would totally kill for a team that they had in the show. Silicon Valley obviously came out after this, so I would reflect on this later here in here in Vegas, watching the Silicon Valley show. When I was traveling, I would watch it in hotel rooms now and then. When I was traveling for Intel during my time living here in Vegas, which continues today, I only would later watch the entire series, but interesting to catch it now and then while I was traveling and saying, that's ridiculous. None of these things would all happen to the same four people. That's crazy. I would leave out Erlich Bachman. So watch out for characters like that. And then the chaos of job changing and game playing was present. So some aspects of that show are real, even though they're exaggerated, but on a longer timeline. So that means things would happen episodically for them. I mean, obviously there was a giant arc, but a particular episode would have so much happening in so short a time for the sake of comedy and the script. But a lot of the things that are depicted in the show did sort of happen, but over a longer time. It wasn't days and weeks, but weeks and months, years. So there were some aspects that were interesting, but absolutely not any sort of basis for like historical research. Absolutely not. There are good books like the one I referred to earlier. You can talk to actual people who were there. As you will learn in part 2, the re-entry to Silicon Valley. After my 4-year stint in Phoenix, Arizona, I would return, spend another, 2005 to 2013. That's another about 7 years. And 8 years, depending on what the months were. I think it was October or something. But the re-entry was interesting, and there was a lot learned. And if you talk to people who were there, they will give you a better version. If you look at Silicon Valley today and you want to emulate that, you are mistaken. So there's a whole bunch of culture that started not in 1993 when I got there, although I would take credit for it if I could, but it started in 1947. And that is the topic of many documentaries and YouTube presentations and stories and history itself. And that's where I will end this version, this component of a very long story. There's been a host of noises going on through this production, so I'll apologize if this gets all weird while you're listening to it. It's been a while since I've walked through my time in Silicon Valley. I think most people discount the stories of people who were there if you are not a celebrity like Mark Andreessen or fill in the blanks. So I say Mark Andreessen because he theoretically has a residence somewhere in the Vegas area, but I don't even know if he still does. Mark Wahlberg, celebrated for being a celebrity, but also for being the Hollywood 2.0 champion, if that ever happens. Much like Silicon Valley, you cannot simply call a place Hollywood 2.0. So Silicon Valley 2.0, no, not that either. Better Vegas. But anyway, that's where I'll leave it. I will remind you to check out the buymeacoffee.com/Dan Hugo profile page for links to my other productions and projects. You do not have to buy me a coffee. But since I have been distracted I think lazy is a better word, but distracted. I have not deployed the various properties on the internets to self-host proper show notes and other, items, other content. So for the moment, you can find those projects at that one hub. No pressure to buy coffee, but if you do, monies will go towards actual coffee. And that is where I will leave it. Thank you for listening. This was a super long episode. There will be another one that may be almost as long next week, the re-entry to Silicon Valley, and then we'll go from there. And again, the cover, the show image, I guess, the cover art is linked in the show notes in the links section, a stylized map of Silicon Valley circa 1993. There will be one for 2005 when I return. It's a cool website that I found those on. So enjoy. Thank you for listening. My voice is tired. Hopefully you're sick of hearing me. Get off that treadmill. It's been a long run. Take care. Part 2 next week. Don't miss it.